Thank you for everyone's patience. I appreciate that everyone came out this evening. So now we're going to start. I'd like to first thank this institute, the Frederick van Zyl Slabet and CARES, for their partnership to make this event become a possibility. We really appreciate their partnership. So what we're going to do now, she's going to address us for a few minutes, and then after that we'll open the question and answer session. So I don't think she needs any introduction, but those who follow me will know that she's been active in student movements, fees must fall, and then we know that in the tertiary institution sector currently there are many topical issues going on. We saw it started with roads must fall, and then we also saw with hashtag end sourcing, and currently the topical issue in roads, we see female students really agitating when they say they want to own their bodies. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome Lovelyn Nwadeyi.
Okay, good evening everyone. So a part of me feels like I need to apologize for keeping you waiting, but just a small part of me. Yeah, sorry about that. When you are keeping the capitalist world turning and going round and round, the masters have certain rules, and so I was busy obeying the masters' rules, and therefore I couldn't leave before 5. That was a very fancy way of saying that I'm sorry I'm late. Okay, so firstly I just want to say that as a young woman being here, for me, I'm aware that women nationally obviously have been going through a lot. This year there was a very unfortunate incident here at Harmony, and a student being raped, and I can't even begin to imagine sort of how horrifying and really traumatizing it is to think that your home, at least for the time that you're here, isn't a safe space, and isn't a space that you can feel 100% comfortable in. So I don't want to say give my condolences, because that sounds very sort of like, cliche, but I just want you guys to know that it is something that I think many others are aware of, and I think as a woman I can share in that pain and share in the grief that it brings. I think it's also just it's just traumatizing to think that it doesn't end. So I remember when I was a student, so I was in Namisha. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending, how you feel about Namisha. But I was in Rez for a year and a half, and I remember that in the year and a half that I was in Namisha, there was quite a few incidences of rape as well. Not at Namisha. I think the one was at Irene, and I can't remember. I think the other one was actually at one of the boys' Rezes. So it was just, I think it's just, it's annoying, it's frustrating, but it's also very, it causes me personally a lot of grief to think that, these things still happen. In any case, so talking to you guys tonight, I did prepare a little address, but my system is just being slow. And I think a part of what I wanted to talk about was definitely addressing this issue of rape culture. Last week, on Friday, I think it was, I was very lucky that I got the opportunity to host the Ready Clubby show on 702. And part of the discussion that we had was this thing about rape culture, and a very interesting point that was raised was the fact that when we talk about rape culture, as soon as we label something a culture, we normalize it, right? And then we make it like something that we've accepted, something that's okay. Which, of course, is definitely not the intention of the term. But I do think, on the other hand, that it's also this two-edged sword, because on the other hand, it is a culture. So even though we don't have to accept it for it to be a thing that happens, right? We don't have to accept rape culture for rape culture to be true. And I think part of the power in the discussion around rape culture is also pointing out that rape perhaps is the extreme, right? Like rape and domestic abuse and domestic violence. That's like on the far end. That's like when rape culture, I suppose, manifests itself in all its violence and all its evil and everything that comes with it. But the other side, I think, of it is the fact that it is possible for one to, or almost impossible rather, for me as a woman to walk down the street without being violated. So, when I think of days where, I may be walking down the road and I'm going to the shop, if I'm walking past a construction site, or if I'm walking past a bergie, like the men there own my body, and you will walk past and you'll be catcalled and you'll be referred to in ways that you almost can't react fully, because it's not considered that bad. Like, you can't get upset about that, because why are you getting upset? The man is just giving you a compliment about your beautiful butt, or your little waist, which I don't have, or whatever. And so it's almost like, societally speaking, we neither have the right to respond and fight it, nor do we have the right nor do we feel like it's okay for us to just accept it and move on. And I think that's sort of the double contradiction that we find ourselves in. So, to start off then the address, I remember when this thing happened, I'm someone that I sort of express and deal with things through writing. And so when the naked protests actually began, so when the ones happened here at Stellenbosch at Woordfees, and when the road students also then, did the reference list protest, the only thing that came to my mind was the following words: young woman, you are not your breasts, you are not your hips, you are not your womb, you are not your vagina, you are not property, you are not a thing, you are not. You are human, and you have the right to be. Young woman, you are not your breasts, you are not your lips, you are not your legs, you are not your bottom, you are not your clitoris, you are not property, you are not a thing, you are human, and you have the right to be. And so as a woman at our university campuses, and as I just mentioned now, have been demonstrating in recent protests, no one, and absolutely no one, has the right to our bodies without our consent. And I think that even if we were to walk down the streets naked in all of our glory, with our breasts dancing in the noonday sun and our bottoms demanding to be honored as they led the way to our freedom as women, we would still be the only owners of these sacred carriers of life. At no point do we ever cede the authority or the ownership that we have over our bodies to any other individual by virtue of the clothes that we wear or don't wear, or by virtue of the places we go to or don't go to. That a woman's lived experiences and access to humanity is to be censored by a world dominated by male privilege is unjust. And therefore we cannot live our lives in fear of rapists, and neither should we live our lives in the kind of reductionism that forces us to make ourselves smaller, whether this is physically, intellectually, or spatially. We cannot and we should not make ourselves skinnier or lighter or curvier in order to meet the international demand that men across the world have placed on our bodies and our beauty. We cannot and we should not have to tailor our clothes to suit the tastes of men that surround us in order to exempt ourselves from being raped. Our dressing and our undressing is not for the pleasures and the comfort of men. We cannot and we should not reduce our ability to claim space in the boardrooms and the government houses of South Africa because we dread the disrespect of male colleagues, or because our intellectual contributions are not considered as valid as theirs. To make ourselves smaller, women, would be to relegate ourselves to the endnotes of history books and forego our place as the authors and the custodians of history as it starts, continues, and even as it ends the way we know it. As women, we owe it to ourselves to rise and break down every barrier and every limitation that is placed on us by the spaces that we occupy simply because we carry a womb. And so, to the women of this nation, we are not our vaginas, we are not our wombs, we are not our breasts. We are human, and we have a right to be. And so even when we have been raped, even when we have been violated, even when we have been abused, we are still not our vaginas. We are still not our wombs, and we are still not our breasts. Our honor is not tied to our biological attributes. And so it is against this backdrop that I want to situate my address today, in the context of dismantling the master's house. I would like to quote a Facebook status that was recently shared by Ntabaleng Morake, a UCT student. One of the things that I was taught as a child, she says, was that my body attracts and will always attract violence. It is an uncomfortable thought to know that everywhere I go, I will be butchered and slaughtered until I yearn not to exist anymore, unless the violence kills me first. The fear of being raped, she continues, has always been one that is tattooed very deeply in the walls of my heart. I'm reminded of a time in grade 11. I was walking to the police station to certify documentation so that I could apply for admission to UCT. The police station was quite far, and I'd often recruit my friends who did not necessarily want to study at UCT to accompany me, because it was never safe for me to walk all the way to the police station and back on my own. The irony. So on this particular day, I got someone to walk me, and approximately 5 minutes away from the station, my friend and I were approached by 4 men who were walking the opposite direction from us. When this happened, I was conversing with my friend until one of them said to me, "The way ukhuluma kamnandi ngakhona, I wonder ukuthi ebhedini ukhala kanjani." In English, this translates to the way you speak so beautifully. I wonder how you cry and moan in bed. The 3 other men he was with began to laugh. What he said was considered plausible, and they found joy and entertainment in it. While I tried continuing with my journey, "Focus, Nteba, focus, you are almost there. Don't mind him," I repeatedly said to myself in my head. But I was angry and violated, and I felt unsafe. But what could I do? I kept on walking. No reply, no demonstration of my anger, nothing. But my rage was doing the complete opposite. I wanted to punch him or violate him back or make him feel as unsafe as I had felt then. My friend could see how bruised I was. And so in an attempt to make me feel better, she said, "You know these Nyope boys, they have no respect." Whilst then, back in 2012, I appreciated the efforts of my friend to make me feel better. Spending time reflecting on rape culture this year, I made aware of how violent her response was. She excused the violence and threat that my body and psyche were subjected to by making a claim that I shouldn't care because the act of violence was conducted by a supposedly intoxicated person. Moreover, she reduced my safety, my entire safety and well-being in the face of what was a clear act of violence, to an issue of respect. I did not want those men's respect. I am not made of or from respect, so I did not want their respect. I wanted to feel safe and be safe. This happened 5 minutes away from a police station. If anything, I was supposed to feel safe there. Ntabaleng continues, and she says, "We walked away from these men, and I never saw the man again. Days later, I struggled to cope and kept wondering what could have happened if I was alone, and if it was a night or any other environment in which rape is recognized as legitimate. Because, you know, it's not real if it's during the day, or even worse, if it's next to the police station. It's not real." I remember getting my things certified and telling the police officer of what happened, and he replied by saying, "I see what he meant. You do have a nice voice, Mummy." The officer proceeded to laugh while sharing this story to his colleagues, who also joined in whilst imitating my accent, and this defeated me. So when Pumla Gola writes, "Rape is not a moment, it is a language," I understand this, and I completely relate to it. While that man on the street may not have physically touched me or penetrated me or did whatever is conventionally understood as sexual harassment, his words, his language, his joke was so violent that I'm permanently triggered and wounded by it. They laugh while we bleed. They laugh because to them our lives do not matter. We need to do better with how we respond to each other. And that's the end of the Facebook status that she made. And so when I look at the naked protests that have been taking place at Stellenbosch, at Wits, at the university currently known as Rhodes, I look at the comments that people have made. Julle weet mos in South Africa, we're never at a loss for commentary. So what they say when they, when people write these comments that, oh, what is a naked or a topless body going to do to stop people from raping you? Or why are you naked? You must cover your boobs because your boobs is your dignity. How illogical these brave students, have been considered to be. And this word illogical keeps popping up when I look at commentaries about the protests happening at the moment. And illogical is a very powerful word. Illogical implies that there is no logic, of course. Illogical implies that there's no sense. Illogical implies that there is no thought, no real answer to the problem. Protests, however, as Ashraf Jamal writes, are never quite logical. They are expressions of a toxic and gnawing grief. A grief that only an individual whose body has always been a center for violation will ever be able to understand. Logically speaking, however, power, whether held by patriarchs or racists, power is never conceded without a struggle and without a shock. Power is never given. Power can only be taken. And this makes a naked protest, in my mind, the only logical conclusion in a fight against rape culture and rape crimes. For us to understand rape culture and to fight against it, we must also understand the psychology of a patriarchal society. It is the kind of psychology in which a woman's body cannot exist outside of its functionalities, outside of its use for penetration, conception, and exploitation. And I mean these terms in all figurative and literal meanings that they come with. And so the damaging psychological underpinnings of patriarchy, and more so colonial patriarchy, allows us to attempt to make sense of the kind of ruthless subjugation and evisceration of our bodies, our minds, and even our imaginations of ourselves as women. The naked protests, I think, have been a platform, through which women could make themselves vulnerable without a reductionism that limits them to a set of functions. It was sort of like a what you gonna do moment, And the reactions of South African men and women in the last while have been, at the very least, a negation of our humanity. And I think by stepping out and stepping forward, victims of rape culture nationally are refusing to have any history of oppression continuously performed on, through, or against them. We can, however, not talk about patriarchy without talking about colonialism and racism and the interconnection between the two. For no matter how much we want to deny it, these are essentially different sides of the same coin. In school, I remember doing Busman and Leena in grade 11. One of, I think, Athol Fugard's best play, actually. And Busman and Leena was so traumatizing for my grade 11 mind. Both Busman and Leena were oppressed by the apartheid system, okay? And yet Busman turned Leena into his verbal, physical, and emotional punching bag. And so for me, Busman and Leena is a perfect example of how even black men that are equally oppressed by institutionalized racism can be enforcers of institutionalized rape culture as well. And as Fugard's protagonist Busman points out, he says, "I'm thinking deep tonight. We're white man's rubbish. That's why he's so beneact with us. He can't get rid of his rubbish. He throws it away, we pick it up, we wear it, we sleep in it, we're made of it now. His rubbish is people. Busman and Lena's story points out how invasive and corrosive the exploitation of others can become. Because one no longer merely represents the oppressed, but one internalizes the very psychic wiring of oppression itself. And this is also what Biko says when he writes in I Write What I Like. He declares the first step is to make the black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. And so for me it is that if we're going to move forward, every single one of us must recognize our complicity in the maintenance of an oppressive system. My friend Fezi refers to women who have internalized sexism and encourage and uphold these oppressive standards against women. She refers to them as patriarchal princesses. Women who have been so battered and brutalized by patriarchy that the only way that they are able to participate in society is to internalize it and accept it. Cis heterosexual men who claim to be allies in this decolonization struggle, but cannot even try to engage in the politics of gender and non-binary sexuality, they must acknowledge their complicity. White women whose tears matter more than anyone else's globally must also acknowledge their complicity in global patriarchy and women's oppression. And white men who have never been convicted and who have never atoned for centuries of raping black women must also acknowledge their complicity. I'm done.
Yeah, this was heavy. She says power is not given, it is taken. So we can engage and then we can ask questions, we can comment. This is that. Yeah.
Me, I'd like to know about these comrades in the revolution that are there when we're fighting racism, when we're fighting white supremacy, but are nowhere to be found when it's now time to fight rape culture. What do we do? How do we hold those black men accountable? Because which struggle is more important than the other? The race one or the gender one, and can we separate the two? I just think we need to, I'm asking, what are the ways in which we can hold these comrades that fight this revolution alongside us accountable for this struggle?
Do you have another hand?
Before I answer your question, I just want to say that I think even discussions like this tend to explain why often the gender struggle is seen as secondary to, the racial struggle, right? Or the struggle for racial equality is always first, and then gender equality becomes next. I think that if I'd sat through my brief talk or introduction and I'd said at least 5, controversial things about white people or about black people or about affirmative action or BEE, hands would be up, right? Because we've learned how to decide for ourselves what we take personally and what we don't take personally. And so for me, it's that I think, so your question being about how do we deal with the fact that we've got this decolonization moment happening, and at any given point in time, in as much as we're fighting for decolonization, in terms of the acknowledgement of black bodies as being valuable and human and important, everyone's happy for us as black women especially, I think, but women in general, to participate. And I think the reason for this is is because when we talk about oppression, and when we talk about undoing systems of oppression, I think that for the most part human beings are very sort of utilitarian, right? So what's the first thing I can get, and I sort myself out and I move on. And I think that as uncomfortable as conversations around racism and white privilege are for white people, I think it is perhaps equally uncomfortable for black men and men in general to acknowledge male privilege, and to acknowledge how complicit they are in systems that uphold patriarchy. And so I think what happens then is you find, for example, any really lit discussion about racism. So there's a group on Facebook called This Dialogue Thing, right? And on this group, basically, one of the requirements for being able to join this dialogue thing, on the mission statement thing, it says basically, to join this group, if you are white, you must accept that all white people are racist. Okay, that's now how this group says, if you're going to join, you must accept that you are a recovering racist. And I think that that's heavy, right? Because it's like, oh wow, you could be an ally and you must still accept that you are racist in order to join that group. But one of the justifications that this group makes is that if you don't accept that premise, any conversation that comes up, you can easily counter it by saying, no, but I'm not like that. Immediately, you can easily, remove yourself from that discussion and remove yourself from that context. And then it makes it an unfruitful conversation, because then I say you hurt me, you say, but I didn't hurt you, I didn't know I was hurting you. Then the conversation ends. And in the same way, I think that logic applies to, especially how men tend to deal with their male privilege. The fact that men don't think that all of them are sexist, and men don't think that all of them are patriarchal. And I think that it takes a high level of introspection. It's just as uncomfortable for them to do, and I'm not saying that that is an excuse. I'm saying that if you're going to be a real ally in the struggle for gender equality, and in the struggle for ensuring that, women, non-binary individuals, queer individuals at least feel comfortable and safe in their own bodies in society, you're going to have to accept certain things about yourself, even if you don't necessarily think that that is who you are. And that's not an easy thing to do. But in my perspective, and if I'm very honest with you, I think that what women students nationally have done, and when I say women, I mean individuals who self-identify that way. I think what they've done very powerfully was to say that this struggle is going to be intersectional, or it's not going to be at all. And in my mind, I think the same thing. So fees must fall for everyone, or they mustn't fall at all. That's how I see it. So for me, it's that if men are not going to acknowledge the ways in which their very existence can be violating and violent to women in those same supposedly revolutionary spaces, if they're not going to acknowledge that, I do not think that women should even consider putting their bodies on the line. Because in my mind, there's no difference between being violated by a white man or a black man. Violation is violation, right? And that for me is the thing. So I myself am not prepared to fight in a struggle that will just change the color of the emperor at the table. I'm not interested in that. And I think that is why I say power has to be taken, it cannot be given. And so I think what women have done very well is they've paralyzed the struggle nationally. They've paralyzed Fees Must Fall. They've paralyzed it because the momentum, English is not my first language, the strategy and the strategizing and the articulation of the complex politics that is behind, the politics of fallism. That complexity has always been very strongly and very powerfully articulated by women, right? And by those who identify themselves that way in this process. And so, in as much as women then say we're tapping out, we're actually just going to sort out this gender thing first before we take this further. I think if that's a decision that women have made, I think it's a perfectly logical decision to make, because unless women take up more space, unless we take up more space, unless we claim more space, unless we make more noise, that's going to result in some sort of tangible action, we will not be heard and we will not be recognized. And I think that's what happened even when you look at the, post-1994 South Africa. So the voices of women were very instrumental in the anti-apartheid struggle, but their voices were not valuable enough for that to carry through into a really different South Africa for women, and especially black women, in the post-apartheid context. And so when we think of things like Codesa, how many women were there? And when we think of there's just so many examples that you can think of where women were so instrumental in that struggle, but women's voices are erased. And that's how you end up, I think especially in South Africa, that's how we end up with our history books, shoving Mandela and shoving Mbeki and shoving all these people down our throats without really acknowledging the contributions of Winnie Mandela, and this is really the reality, that women are systematically erased from history, and especially women that we don't like, right? So women that scare us, those women are even more erased from history. And I think it's also because even when we're talking about decolonization, even when we're talking about equality, we don't think it's important to acknowledge the very nuanced experiences of women, and especially in this case, black women. The levels of violence that black women have to deal with and accept and be quiet about and sacrifice themselves for, all because of this greater struggle for equality. And so I think, again, if this movement is not going to be intersectional, if this movement is not going to be, if it's not going to make equal space, for the politics of gender, then screw it. Because either way, we're screwed. So, might as well all be screwed with us. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Hello.
You mentioned white tears. And,
Yes.
white women's tears, and I read the post you shared about, it was very, very informative. And again, it's all about being exposed to something I've never even realized. And, but so apart from how ridiculous I think we can agree the wide reaction was to the whole waitress.
Tipgate.
Tipgate. What is your opinion of what actually happened and the statement was made even before?
Yeah. Guys, Tipgate. Hey, Tipgate is a difficult one. And now I must think very carefully about my answer.
Okay, we can take the two.
Yes, let me take more. Yeah, good. Thanks, man. I like your strategy. Yes.
I was just going to say, you said that we must acknowledge our complicity. Would you say it could be a domino effect, that once we acknowledge our complicity in whatever it is that we ought to, that and we start fighting against it, we get more people to acknowledge their complicity and then fight against it, and we kind of branch out? Or would you say that it would become like an unreachable goal, because there's always going to be that one person who's just ignorant and refuses to acknowledge their complicity?
Okay, so my question is a bit off topic, but so we have a few of the television participants here, and they've gone through all these discussions as well and engaging with one another. And my question is, you as a thought leader, so they have this vast amount of knowledge and understanding of the issues that our society is facing. How do they go about now equipping themselves furthermore and actually becoming agents of social change in their respective communities? And I mean, you are a student leader and a leader yourself, so what advice can you give them to kind of equip themselves to go beyond those expectations?
Okay, let's take the pen and then share the time.
Well, I was also part of the Metanoia Leadership course, and as well as that, I was able to be part of 2 plays that Metanoia put on over the course of last week. And through through all of these experiences, I've learned so much more about what it means as a man being part of rape culture. I now know what that is. I know what it means. And even though I heard it all around on the news while I was still in high school, etc., it didn't ever impact me. So now, the thing is, I know it's important for everyone to hear these things, but the people who really, really, truly need to hear the type of things that we are discussing right now are not the ones who are here. And how would you suggest to branch out to a point at which those people are the ones actually listening? And would you agree or disagree with the fact that these things need to be brought up earlier, not only in higher education, but also in high school?
Cool. Thank you for your questions. So, you guys, now you've asked questions. Now I'm like, ish. I don't know how to answer these questions. So Tipgate was an interesting case for me. I also have Ntokozo on my Facebook. So then when I saw it, I was just like, my eyes are opened now. These people are taking things, literally taking things like, to the streets. And I think that the comment that most people have made, and that was really my first thought to what happened, was a white waitress doesn't get a tip. A white waitress is also told that black people want the land back. She cries, bursts into tears, manager comes in, you're racist, argument, walk out. And when I think about that moment, for me it's that we can say, he was a jerk, he shouldn't have done that. Why would you do that? It's just lame. Why hold this girl accountable for centuries of, oppression? She's not the one that stole the land. It was her grandfather. Like, you can say all these things, right? No, but really. But the thing, and if I'm going to be very honest with you, for me it comes down to the fact that there's a significant political ignorance amongst white people in this country. And when I say political, I don't talk about political as in knowing what the ANC stands for, what the DA stands for, but I talk about understanding like the metaphorical power of certain acts. So just as a comment is written on a slip and then she's traumatized, just as students occupy a building, just as students decide to, do a sit-in, I think white people really lack an understanding of metaphors in South Africa. And so what happens is, even if Ntokozo was being a jerk, right? And even if what he did was rude and, we can be upset with him for that. For me, the fact that she got to cry and have a moment for me epitomized her white privilege in that moment. The fact that she doesn't even have to respond. She doesn't even have to acknowledge. She can just cry and be sad. And the world will not blame her for that. And that for me is where I'm frustrated with that situation. A lot of people will say, no, he was a jerk, he shouldn't have done that, blah, blah, blah. But then he did. Like, he's done it, right? And now what happens is, in that moment, she's the only thing that gets centered. She's the only one that takes up that girl has been on my newsfeed for days. She gets centered in that moment. And so if I'm very honest with you, I don't have sympathy for her. I really don't. Because I think that daily, black South Africans are exposed to 15,000 times worse violence and 15,000 times worse disrespect. And when they are exposed to it, it's not nice. It's not a note. We don't get like nice notes in the classroom. Then someone passes it to you quietly. We don't get that. Someone says it to your face, right? Someone says it's okay to pay outsourced workers at this university 2,500 Rand a month. Someone says that to your face. Someone says to the workers that they may not use the toilets in the residence, that they must go and pee somewhere else. Someone says that, black people, they must just be okay being kafir. So for me, it's like, the fact that she, maybe in this one instance, got exposed to how hardcore and how horrible and how difficult life can be for other people, and yet she got to cry about it, says to me that there's such a great lack of understanding that moment and what that was about. Because in that moment, she made it about her. That moment wasn't about her. It wasn't about her. And I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand me, because I know you people go and tweet. Who go and you tweet misquoted statements here. I'm not saying it's okay to be a jerk, right? I think there's lots of different ways that he could have done that. But I also think that black people in this country, and I think globally, are so over. They're over being policed. They're over being told, don't write a note, rather write a letter to the Human Rights Commission. Don't protest, go to the municipality and schedule a meeting. Don't occupy Winnie Mandela, ask them for me. People are so over that. And I think that, if I'm very honest with you, I think that the more we have these kinds of, bam, in-your-face experiences, the more we're going to get closer to where we need to be. I'm very, honestly, because I think also, if you think about that white waitress, so one of the other comments or arguments that have been brought up, the one is the fact that obviously she was a woman, right? And that, so in that moment, Ntokozo was being very sexist and being patriarchal and. The other argument is that also, well, she's a waitress, she's working class, she's also suffering under this capitalist system. And if I'm, now we're going to go deep. My other perspective on this is the fact that, so, often what happens in cases where black people operate the same way white people operate. So what Ntokozo did there, a white person does it every day in every restaurant in South Africa. A white person refuses to tip. A white person will say, oh, you're stupid, why don't... a white person, it happens every day in the restaurants in South Africa. So what Ntokozo did was assumed, probably metaphorically, a position of very violent power, essentially, right? And offended that girl. And often what happens then is when a black person does that, then the response then is to change gears and to then look at other forms of oppression and not to actually acknowledge the comment and the moment and the discussion about racialized oppression in South Africa. Then we shift and then say, oh no, but she's a woman. And now suddenly we care about women's rights. Yeah. Where have you been though, all this time? So that's the one dimension. But the other dimension is, even when we talk about white people waitressing, guys, can we just be honest though that white people are going to be fine in this country? Really, let's just talk about that. White South Africans, even when they are waiters and waitresses, are going to be fine. And I know you guys will judge me for this. I'm sure there are white waiters here. And I'm not saying that if you're a white waiter or waitress that you should be treated that way. But I'm saying that there needs to be I almost want to say a de-exceptionalization of white people having to just do normal things that black people have been doing for centuries, right? And that for me is part of the other frustration with that moment, that just as white people have to waitress, black people must also waitress. But then when a white waitress gets hurt, the whole world comes to her feet. And the irony, I think, for me of that moment is the comment is, we will not give you a tip until you give us our land. And then she's going to buy a house and buy land. So these are the things for me that we we need to dig so much deeper. Essentially, that's my point. I think we need to dig so much deeper into these moments because it's easy to get lost in the frenzy. When we finish saying that Ntokozo was maybe a jerk in that moment, what else are we saying after that? Does the conversation end there? If it does, then shame on us as a country, because that conversation just can't and should not end there. But I think this is the point, that this whole decolonization agenda, I think what it needs to do is make white people so uncomfortable in their skin, because that, when you reach the maximum uncomfortability in your skin as a white person, that will give you a fraction of a feeling of the experience that it is to be black. And that's where we and it's only when we hit that point that we can be very vulnerable and honest with each other. Then we can all cry together, not just one person crying, So, yeah. So sorry, not the most PC answer, but yeah. In terms of complicity, so I think that was your question, asking about, do we think it's possible that this might be a domino effect? There's always going to be that one person who refuses to change their thoughts and perspectives. It's a difficult question, it's a difficult argument to try and make. I think the problem with all these things we're talking about, right, is that it's institutionalized. So it's not even like, oh, he thinks I'm human now, I'm a woman, I'm human, and then my life is fine. It's that even after he's accepted my humanity, that someone else is still able to hurt and violate that. I think that it has to be very deliberate, and I don't think that when we talk about these kinds of things that we can talk about it on how it manifests on a macro level, right? And we can say government, we can say education, we can say economy, and we can talk about the big picture. But I think that at the end of the day, our experiences as women, as black people of color, all of those things manifest themselves on very individual levels, right? And so I think when we're talking about how we are complicit and how we are able to undo that system, we need to then look at individual actions and individual changes that we can make. So just to give you an example, and Marshall, I think this is also going to help to answer your question as well. Sorry. My apologies. Sorry. No, I'm really sorry about that, because it's not okay to mix up people's names. So I really apologize for that. So the thing is when so what I wanted to say was there's this experiment that was done. So in the 1950s, a husband and wife, both surnamed Clarks, I can't remember their first names now, but the two Dr. Clarks, they were the first African Americans to graduate with psychology PhDs at Columbia University in the States. And so they did this experiment. So in 1950s, this is obviously now like still old America, segregation, etc., etc. And they do what we now know as the doll experiments, right? And so basically what happens is they decided they want to see what is the impact of segregation laws on African American children. So I think they did about 150, 200 kids, and they put in front of these kids a white doll and a black doll. Okay, this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but bear with me. So white doll, black doll, okay? And then they took children between the ages of 3 and 4. Then they took children between the ages of, I think it was about 8 and 10. And then they took children between the ages of 13, 14, 12, 13, 14, okay? Obviously different stages of growth. And each child, they would put them in front of the doll and they'd say, which doll is good? Which doll is bad? Which doll would you play with? Which doll is smart? Which doll is stupid? So basic words that you can understand at a very young age. And words that you can't really confuse the meaning, right? And we all know children are the most honest beings ever. So this is what they do. So they do this experiment. They do it for little ones. They do it for 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and they do it for teens or early teens. And please note, this is 1950s, right? And the results of this case are shocking, because almost all of the children identified the negative attributes to the black doll. Okay, and they identified all of the positive attitudes to the white doll. This is children, right? And this is now the scary thing about little children, that you think are untainted. And so they do this, and then they do it with white children, of course, and the results are more or less the same, that white children also identify positive attributes with dolls that look like them, and black children will not, okay? So they do this, and then the findings of their case basically prove, at the case, I think it was Brown versus whoever, that... Which one? Thank you. Brown versus the Board of Education, and their case, the research is used, and that this research, gets the Supreme Court to rule that segregation in schools in America is unconstitutional. Let's desegregate. Okay. So this was in 1950s. Powerful research that is done. Also, one of the big findings being that by the ages of 3, 4, and 5, children have already cemented their identity, right? So also this thing where we say people, when a child doesn't feel comfortable in their own skin, we want to judge them. Like children, 3, 4, 5 years old, already have a sense of race. They already have a sense of, you know, what their gender is, you know, what responsibilities and roles are attributed to that. Children have a basic understanding. Fast forward to 2012, okay? This experiment is redone again. Oh, redone again. So the experiment is done once more. And, and this experiment, I think it was done by Margaret Beale. I might have her surname wrong, but she's also a child psychologist professor at the University of Chicago. And she does this project again, but obviously now America looks very different, right? So they take black kids, Latino kids, mixed race kids, and then they take white kids, exactly the same experiment, except in this case, part of it they've got dolls, part of it they've got animated pictures, so like a dark child and a lighter child, and. Same questions: which doll is smart, which doll is stupid, which doll is pretty, which doll is ugly, etc., etc., etc. Barring a little bit more variation in the sort of early teenage group, who sort of are now more sensible and can make decisions for themselves, barring discrepancies in that higher age group, right? The results are more or less exactly the same as what was done in the 1950s, right? The most painful part about me for this experiment was at the end. So each child, after the interview, they asked the child, which doll looks more like you? And then the Latino kids would start to answer by saying, well, this doll, the white doll, looks like me because my back is light and the back of my legs are light. But this brown doll, okay, my ears, yeah, it has my ears, but now I look more like the white doll. Okay? These are kids who are self-negating and self-denying, because they've now answered a series of questions where they've said good is white and bad is black, like summarized version. And then the black kids, when they were asked which doll looks more like you, couldn't answer. A lot of them ran out crying. When you actually read the article that explains what happened, a lot of them just ran out and were frustrated and started crying. And so when you say to me, how do we deal with acknowledging our complicity? And how do we deal with the fact that there's always that one person, right? My response is, A, we have to start somewhere. And we have to start always.
All call. Can Zipo please come to the Sukari? That is all call. Can Zipo asseblief na die Sukari toe kom?
Okay. I must say that's the one thing I don't miss about Ray's. And so for me, it's that we have to be so deliberate. If children as young as 3 and 4 years old already have entrenched thoughts and ideas about themselves, right? It means that we almost have to, for lack of a better term, force ourselves and force those who are around us to think differently, to live differently. So as a white person, you have to force yourself to have black friends, even if the black friends don't want you, right? No, but this is it. You have to push it and make it so deliberate. In this research, the only mitigating factor that they found for where people do have different perceptions or how these racial stereotypes can be overcome is by friendships. That is it. That is the only way that we can break stereotypes about each other. Because what happens is when you meet me, you suddenly realize, oh, but she's a nice person. Sy is mos nou nie besig met hierdie swart gevaar storie. She's actually just Lovelyn, right? And that's what happens, is that as soon as we interact with people in our personal and intimate spaces, that is when these barriers and these boundaries in our minds start to break down. So we have to be deliberate. As as unconscious as we can be in our complicity with the system, we need to be so deliberate about our actions. So men, for example, have to be deliberate in the way they interact with women. So when we sit in meetings, whether it's at work or HALCA meetings or social change courses, men should not echo the things that women have said, right? When we, you know, when you're in a classroom and a black student asks, please can you repeat this thing in English because it was said in Afrikaans, an Afrikaans student needs to say, yes, please repeat this thing in English. You have to push it, because the system is not going to just crumble if we're all comfortably sitting here happy not doing anything about it. And we will always have that one person, right? We will always. And what we should not keep ourselves busy with that one person. We need to keep ourselves busy with those who we have immediate influence and immediate relationships with. And the key thing is to understand that A, it's not an overnight process, but B, it's also not a comfortable process, right? So it also might mean that you will lose some friends or lose some family or. But it also means that at the same time, you need to create for yourself I almost want to say the value matrix that you get out of it, that you do come out of it then with being a better person, but also, you know, having people from different backgrounds in your life that I almost want to say invade and take up space in your life to the point where you are constantly confronted with the things that you need to undo and dismantle. And then I think the last part is also self-education. And I don't think we can undermine or underestimate the value of self-education in these conversations. So for me, the moment any of my guy friends comes and starts with their patriarchy, I'm like, please, bell hooks, go and read. Don't involve me. When my white friends, you know, when we're having debates and arguments, go and read Robin DiAngelo. She's there. And the great thing is that she's a white woman and she's fixing it in jail for us all. So my thing is we need to educate ourselves. And it's also only when you've educated yourself that you're actually able to sit fast in those discussions, because there are discussions that are tough. And if you've not pushed yourself I almost want to say to the boundaries of that understanding, when it becomes too uncomfortable, when that catharsis moment is happening, you're just going to tap out. Because your privilege allows you to do that as a white person or as a man or as a middle class person. As soon as we enter these conversations, if we've not backed up ourselves with, you know, knowledge and also like the heart and the compassion that comes to it, we are able to remove ourselves from those spaces. And we must resist that temptation to remove ourselves from those spaces. What was the other thing? Prisons, yes, no, hold on. High school, branching out, school, tertiary, education. What was your question? Remind me again.
As being part of this type of thing in higher education, and I understand how I influence in this whole great scheme, but do you think that it should be brought down earlier, such as high school, so that people learn from their parents?
For sure.
If told earlier that it's wrong, then no one will ever learn earlier.
For sure.
And we'll just keep going until this point now.
Yeah, for sure.
And,
No, I'm with you. Do you know what it is? I think I fully agree with you. I mean, I think that high school is even too late, guys. Because then we get to varsity, then we're all traumatized. And then we don't know what we must do. I'm losing my white friends, my guy friends are losing their girlfriends, and it's just a mess, you know? So, I mean, I really do think it's something that has to start very early. But the big thing as well is that it's not just a matter of starting the conversation early. I think it's that it doesn't help if you go to a school, for example, right, where your teacher is lit and she's teaching decolonization, like, you know, anything, and then you go home and then your parents are also just doing their own thing, and you have your brides and people. So it's also that even in the way that we educate people, right, the education we offer to people needs to be empowering. And I'm not going to lie to you and pretend like I have the answers for that. I don't know what teaching 3 to 4 year olds about anti-racism and anti-sexism would look like. But I do know that it would mean that even the spaces that we put them in, even the classrooms that we put them in, the way that they interact with their teachers, the way that they're taught to interact with fellow boys and girls, all those little things need to change. And we need to then have us who would be parents, for this now agenda that we want to push, we would need to have us very deliberate and very conscious about that. So forcing our children to go to schools where there are more black teachers than white teachers, because little white kids need black role models. Part of the problem with our country is the fact that so many white kids grow up without black role models, and so many black kids grow up without black role models. No wonder we're traumatized. I had such an intense moment the other day, and I'm sorry, and I'm derailing from your question. The other day, I was watching this awards show. Now I can't remember. In any case, the Black Lives Matter women came up and they were talking and they were like, they're dedicating that moment to Trayvon Martin and then after that I ended up, because on YouTube then one video plays and then two videos play and then it's like 1 o'clock the next day, But so I was watching this video and it was a little after that Barack Obama said something about, the Charleston shootings and Trayvon's death and everything, and saying that Trayvon could have been his son, right? So it could have been his son walking down the road with a hoodie and still being shot. And I thought to myself, when I was in Stellenbosch, whenever I would walk down Victoria Street after a night out, honestly, if a black guy walked past me, I would cross the road. I would cross that road faster than anything. I've never crossed the road when a white man was on the street with me. Never. And this tells me that there's something for me even very twisted about what our society has done to us, right? It makes me afraid of people that look like me. It happens all the time. When I'm driving out of my work building, there was this also one day, this old colored woman, probably a Bergi, probably not, I don't know. He looked old and colored, so I assumed he was a Bergi, right? And this is already like how deep the messed upness is. And I remember I locked my doors and pulled up my windows. And then 2 minutes later I got to a circle. I'm like, yeah, Lovelyn, look, your politics, you must practice your own politics. But this is the thing, is that it's so messed up that we've gotten to a point where even we think incorrectly about ourselves. And I think that's also part of it, is that in creating the kind of society that we want, we need to force ourselves to be what we want to see, right? And that's very Mahatma Gandhi-ish and problematic. But if I'm being very honest and uncliched about it, for me it's that, I can't have my children in a school that has predominantly white teachers. At least, by the time I have kids, surely there will have to be enough black teachers that are competent. I need my kids to have black role models. And I think I need you as well to also have black role models, because that's the only way it starts to change your perspective. And your role model can't just be Mandela. And this is the thing in our society that, Mandela ends up being the only black role model for white people, because Mandela didn't ask for, for reparations. Mandela didn't ask for land. Mandela didn't, and he was a patriarch. That's in jail, another case. Lord, we can't go there. But really, just to synthesize it, I think it comes down to, yes, education from the most basic levels, but it's being deliberate. It's being deliberate in the things that we do, in the places we go to, in the way we raise our children, in the ways we relate to our sisters and our brothers and our moms and our dads. And the thing is, guys, what we want to do in South Africa is we want to be lit and decolonial, but we also want to keep our comfort. We want to have it all, right? And it's not possible. It's not possible. So it's not possible for you to, be, for example, a white male ally and also be comfortable at a Braai on Friday when your family and friends are there saying what they say, right? It's not possible to have both. And at some stage, you're going to have to push yourself to be like, this is not acceptable. And if the consequence of your statement is that you don't get to be part of that space, then that is the consequence. We've not reached that place, I think, in our politics, whether it's as women or as men or as black or colored or Indian or white people, we've not reached that space where we accept that this comes with a cost and it comes with some sort of price. Of course, every individual will see for themselves what that expense is. But if we're not ready for that, and if we're not open to that, again, we're going to be able to always tap out and remove ourselves from that. And then we shoot ourselves in the foot. Yeah.
When you asked him what his question question was, he missed, like, the other thing that he asked that I would just...
I love a woman echoing a man. Yes. Go, girl.
Because it's something that's very relevant to my life. What his point is, we're part of the Meta leadership course and we speak about this stuff, but like, especially in Meta, it's a lot of the same people having the same conversation. Or the conversation,
oh, yes,
the topic,
yes.
it's the same people having it, which
yes.
is great, because you're helping yourself and, you know, cool. But the people who need to be having these conversations or need to be getting involved or their minds need to be exploring, and it's going to be people you're going to have relationships with.
Yes.
So his question was, how do you get those people into this room? And so I'm saying, I'm not even sure how to ask it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think also the idea and the assumption that people need to be brought into a space. Okay, and I must now word this correctly. The logic of your argument makes sense, right? We need more people to hear this, and we need the people who need to hear it to hear it. But for me, it's also that when we say we need to bring people into these discussions and bring people into these spaces, we assume that these spaces are safe and okay. We assume that these spaces are foolproof. We assume that we are so clear and educated and empowered and lit and decolonized that, you know, this is the place to be. And I say that knowing that I feel a lot of times that I think that and people even think that of me, right? And so I think it's also acknowledging that in this process of learning, you never know it all. You never have the answers, and you can never assume the primary, I don't want to say the primary voice, but for the purposes of this conversation, you can never assume that. But the other side, I think, as well, is the moment we leave it to people to be brought into these spaces, I think it's a very easy out. It's an easy excuse. Because if I have to bring you into this space, then you don't come, then what happens? If I don't bring you here, then what? Then you will never be reached by the decolonization gospel, right? and so for me, it's that while I hear you and I hear the logic and I agree with it, because I did Fansel Slabbert and I did all these things and it was always the same faces, so I understand your logic. But I do think the other side is that is a very easy and comfortable thing to do, to say, come into my space, we'll have the discussion, and. I think the real power of a discourse is when you run out there with it and you almost, for lack of a better term, impose is not the right word because that's also just, and you almost like spring it on people that they can't but engage with that discourse. And that for me is, for example, what Fees Must Fall was last year. And it's what Rhodes Must Fall, for all its faults and all its problems, it's also what Rhodes Must Fall did. Was that Rhodes Must Fall didn't say, come, let's have a plenary meeting, let's have a nice, what do we call these things, seminars or discourse. No, Rhodes Must Fall was like, but that statue must fall. Then they took it out, and they forced us as a country to have that discussion. Where did that discussion come from? We didn't even, it wasn't even, it's not like there was a news story, and then there was like 3 complaints to the Human Rights Commission, and then there was like, one toy there in one township, and then Rhodes fell. It happened. It just happened. And this, I think, is part of the understanding of what decolonization is about. That decolonization isn't just a discourse of comfort. It's not a discourse of sitting on couches and sitting together and having nice discussions, right? This I think is also the supposedly illogical aspect of decolonization, is that it's not going to be comfortable and it's not going to be nice. And so it means that if I can't bring you into the space, so in Nigeria we have this thing, if Muhammad will not go to the mountain will come to Muhammad, for whatever that means and whatever that implies for the space that you're in, right? And I think figuring that part out of what that actually practically manifests as, I think that's a responsibility for everybody individually. But I kid you not, I think we try so hard to make these things about big solutions, when a lot of the times it's little things, and it's little understandings of how we behave and how we treat each other that would really make a big difference. So I hear you and I understand the logic, because I think that's also how we've been trained to think about things, that things must must always be, that people must always be brought in, we must be co-opted, and. But we forget that, in terms of the way the world works and in terms of the way the system works, we don't actually get that many choices. Right? And I don't say that to advocate an autocratic, again, you tweeting misquotas. I don't say that to advocate an autocratic dictatorship where we go out and we shove it down your throats, because I think this is a very, as much as it is a large-scale political and macro, movement, I think it's also very much a personal one. And even me as an individual, my personal politics is consistently changing, Many people who knew me before I left Stellenbosch and know me today are traumatized. So I'm really with you so it is very much a personal process, but I wouldn't be able to have these discussions if I wasn't sitting in my office in Nigeria and then I saw poo on Cecil John Rhodes' face, and then I was like, Lord, what are my people doing? And then I went and I read up and I was like, oh, but of course. So it is this thing where they are, yes, so, and certain things just will have to trigger us, and certain things will have to force us to have those discussions. And I think we must be open to that. So we must be open to, I think, so say for example in your life, I think you must be open to, for example, if you've got a friend that is being sexist or is being homophobic or is being, racist, you must be able to cut that friend out of your life. Do you understand? Because it doesn't fit in with what is acceptable and what is right and what should be and what is fair. And that's scary, though. It's scary to think I'm like if I talk to you about my friendships, it's scary to think about that, right? But it's those actions that we need to take on a micro level individually that will get us to this large scale agents of social change moment. Yeah.
Okay, guys, due to time, can you get final hands, then we can wrap up. So it will be your hand, and then we still have another one? Okay, let's take you then.
When you mentioned the whole, people are assuming that when we're talking in such areas, there's a safe space. For the past, let's say 2 weeks, my friends and I have been having large arguments about the way people are trying to, how can I put in, revolutionize, let's say that. And our argument was, these so-called safe spaces, we tend to feel the most unsafe in them. Not because we're being challenged, but because we feel that sometimes people are very opinionated, which is a good thing because we need to know where we're taking this and where we're going. And personally, I know I've been in situations where I thought, yes, I support this, I understand. I may not understand, okay, the violence you're using to pass the message on, but I will take it because we're trying to go to the same goal. But I sometimes also feel personally that people are implementing new systems. They're not allowing us to help us build the new systems for change. They're telling us, listen, this is what's happening. This is what we wanted to happen. And these are the standards we uphold. And when you try to question them, you're like, okay, fine, you have these new standards that you're trying. Who says those standards are right? Because we are not working together to establish these standards. And then they get emotional, which is fine, because I'm a very passionate person. When I believe something's right, I'll be like, hey, wait, this is the way it is. But at the same time, I've also learned that if we're doing things that require social change, the main point of social is the people. You must also be open-minded enough to let people express their opinions and to build from there. So the problem sometimes you find that people that are in the front lines, they just cut you off automatically once you start saying something different. And the thing that really started this conversation was when in Res we had a talk about rape culture. And the speaker was speaking, and at first, I was on her side. I was like, yes, tell them, this is how it is. But something that she did that made me feel unsafe in that space was when she was like, okay, you can't talk because you're doing this, you can't talk because you're doing this. I felt like she was blocking the channels of communication by doing that. And yes, I agree that some of the guys, the things they were saying were not in support of what we're saying and what we're trying to fight. But I thought it was important that we let them talk, we let them hear those things that we don't want to hear, to see what are we working with, like to study our environment and to build together. Because if we don't know what we're opposing, what it's saying, and how we're moving there. And then she started going, and stop there. I feel this way. And at some point, I felt like it was her show rather than like a conversation. That's the I feel like that's the important message I just want to pass, is that if we're going to have a social conversation, understand the meaning of social first before we start changing the society. We can't change one because we have one opinion. If we set standards, we're going to set them together, and you're going to listen to what you think is bullshit from me, and I'm going to listen to what I think is bullshit from you, and we're going to find logic in that, and we're going to build up. You can't just come to me and tell me this. I have a brain. You can't move me from one system to another just like that. It doesn't work like that.
Is there another one? Oh.
Okay, we're going to take you then. Really close.
Question with the whole, it's all good and dandy that, you know, with the metanoia leadership course, now you have all this information. So when we talk about apartheid, you can also, you know, add your views there. But then, like, how do we go about that? Like, in like everyday life, how do we put that information to use? Like, how do we, you know, live our lives with all this information that we've, you know?
It's exhausting. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I wasn't at this event, so I don't have the background context. But I think I hear the point, the overarching point that you're saying is that if we, it's very easy to silence people in the name of decolonization, right? It's very easy to do that. And it's very easy to just shut people down because we don't like or agree with what they're saying. Now, I think there's different ways to look at this and different ways to approach it. And again, I think it depends on that context. For me, I think is when we're looking at these kinds of conversations, we cannot ignore power dynamics and power constructs, okay? And so by that I mean that if we're sitting in this room and say today's topic was apartheid, in this room today, that's what we're talking about. In order for, and all of us are here in this room, black, white, colored, Indian, all of us, right? In order for us to have a fruitful and honest discussion in this room about apartheid, white people would need to be quiet for half of that conversation. And the reason I say that is because, logically speaking, in a discussion like that, a white person would hold all the power, for lack of a better term, right, that is associated with this subject historically, politically, economically, socially, in all versions. And so it means that even at a white person's most vulnerable moment, so when a white person sits here and says, I can't deal, apartheid traumatizes me, my dad fought in the border war, my dad has PTSD. When a white person even gives you that highest level of their vulnerability and their guilt and their shame that they're carrying, in this space, what ends up happening is that their voice trumps every other voice in that room. And that's not because the white person is bad. I mean, they're doing a good thing by acknowledging what we're talking about. But it's because of the fact that when we talk about power dynamics and power constructs, there's so much that is associated to your whiteness that even at your most vulnerable, you're still stronger than the strongest black person, okay? And what that means then, so I'm doing the one side of the argument, which for me is that when we want to try and have honest conversations, we need to acknowledge that those who haven't been given a chance to speak and those whose voice hasn't been heard for a long time, their voice must dominate that conversation for the conversation to be honest and open. And so if you look at Dr. Robin DiAngelo's work, she writes about white fragility, right? And a lot of her writing focuses on A, why do white people react the way they do, and B, spaces that white people need to create for themselves to deal with that. So when I sit in this room, it doesn't help me if a white person cries or feels guilty, right? Because I can't do anything about it and they can't do anything about it in that moment, but I still feel bad for them. So there's a bit of my agency that I'm letting go. And the same for me applies when we're having discussions, say, about rape culture. When we're having discussions about rape culture, I think that men need to be quiet for a significant part of that conversation. Because what happens is, in terms of the way that we are socialized and the norms that we have, we are not socialized as women to think positively of men's bodies. We are afraid of men's bodies. We are afraid of men's power and their capacity. We are taught to honor and revere and defer to everything that is manly, right? Men are not raised to be scared of women. It's a joke, right? People make jokes about that, like, "She bang for a vrouw." Nee man, put your wife in place, right? People make jokes about things like that. Because men are not socialized to be afraid of us. Men are not socialized to see us as holding any type of power or capacity. And so, when we're having discussions about dismantling certain systems and processes, right? We need to acknowledge that very, very strong power dynamics and very, very strong historical social norms come into that discussion. And so it means that for a part of that process, whoever was the previous dominant needs to allow a space for those who feel that they've been oppressed to flourish. The difficulty, though, and this is what I will acknowledge, is that when you start to make arguments like that, you're bordering on basically saying anarchy, dictatorship, autocrat, go, 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 go. You border on that. And I think that is the real conundrum of these kinds of discourses. The conundrum is that how do we make sure that we eventually end up in a equitable society where everybody feels accepted, whilst at the same time we're trying to put people in their place, right? It's a difficult thing. In my perspective, though, it's that when you are privileged, whether as a man, as a woman, as a heterosexual person, as a white person or as a middle class person, whenever you are privileged, any attempt to give other people a voice will always feel like an attack. And it will always feel like silencing. And in my perspective, it is not the burden of the victim, in this case, to illuminate you on that. I think it is the burden of the privileged to go and make sense of their privilege and to understand how they can be allies in a space. I don't think it is the responsibility of somebody who feels victimized and oppressed to also educate someone on how to be an ally. We live in the 21st century. We have Google. There's so much material out there for people to go and read and make sense of these things for themselves. So, and again, what that means then is that when we are in these spaces, it's very difficult for me, if we're having a discussion about privilege, to talk about equality. Because I don't believe that when we're having a discussion about privilege, that we should talk about equality. We must talk about privilege. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so for me, it's that as soon as we try to shift gears and say, oh no, but the men feel that they're being silenced, or the white people that feel that they're being silenced. For me, it's the fact that, but there are more than enough spaces where you are not being silenced. There are more than enough spaces where your voice does have power, where your actions do have agency. And those are the spaces then that you should use to inform and educate yourself. So one of my friends, for example, works in a church, and then at that church, the white people have certain sessions only for white people. Because there are spaces where white people need to sit and make sense of the white condition. And they don't need black people to be in those spaces. There are churches where they say no white people allowed, because there are spaces where black people need to understand and make sense of their existence and their spirituality outside of the presence of white people. And this is not a bad thing. This is what we need to understand, that by saying that it's not a bad thing, if you go and read Steve Biko's I Write What I Like, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the value of having spaces without white people, without men, without and these are not spaces that are created for oppressive purposes. So I'm not running the argument of, Stellenbosch is an Afrikaans university, therefore no one must be there. That's not what I'm saying. But there are spaces that are created purely for the purposes of people understanding themselves and understanding their situation. And I think those are the spaces that people should use to deal with and make sense of, is this really silencing, or is this actually a fraction of the experience of people who have been silenced for all this time? Okay? And your last point that I also really appreciate is the fact that, so what happens then for us in our process? Because now we're young people, we're fighting, we're screaming, we're running around, we're burning buildings, doing all these things, and we need to make sense of the kind of country we want to build for ourselves, right? We need to make sense of, like, you know, when we're older and married with kids or not married with kids or civil partnerships and all the things that we can do now. What is the society that we're building? And I say that honestly, not in sarcastic terms. I'm saying, where are we going to? If we're so busy breaking things down, what are we doing to build things up? And for me, when I ask that question saying, we need to understand that there is no such thing as a perfect revolution, for lack of a better term. Okay, so for me it's that there's no such thing as a perfect revolution. There's no such thing as a perfect process or a perfect system. So we came out of apartheid, and then the whole world was like, oh my gosh, South Africa, amazing country, no bloodbaths, you know, everything, and everyone was like supporting us and saying this is great. 22 years later, we now all at each other's throats, right? So, you know, even what our parents tried to fix and make decent enough for us to grow up in and survive in, we're finding fault with that. And we are also going to leave our children with we're not going to leave our children with a faultless system and a faultless process. We need to think about this, and we need to then accept that in this process, A, we must allow ourselves to make mistakes, but B, in making those mistakes, we need to also allow ourselves to imagine different scenarios and different solutions for whatever this is. But that's a learning process. So we can't think that we're going to solve the problems of fees must fall and roads must fall and naked protests and end rape culture in 2016 when people have been trying to solve it for the last 400 years. It's just not going to work, right? But I think we must be open to acknowledging that even in reimagining this new society and even in reimagining what we want to be, some of it is going to get broken down. Some of it is going to be ugly, and some of it is going to require that we start from scratch. And that's why I say it's a personal thing, because you need to decide for yourself how committed you are to the conversation, right? If the conversation about decolonization means a purely communist society where I don't get to have lunch at the waterfront every second weekend, or where I don't get to go wine tasting, or where I don't get to own a car or own a piece of land, if that's what this decolonization agenda practically means, am I prepared for that? And if I'm not prepared for that, then I must be prepared for it, right? Like this, but this is what I'm saying, like this is where we need to go in our discourse and our understanding. Lastly, just to touch on your point, I fully agree with you that for me this process has felt like an information overload. It's exhausting because just when I'm finished making sense of racism, then I must understand patriarchy, then I must make sense of my own, you know, heterosexual privilege, then I must make sense of middle classness. It's just too much and it gets exhausting. Again, I think the point is not to facilitate external approval or external support for yourself. I think the point is to make of yourself the person that you want to become. I think what decolonization and all these buzzwords that we throw around have brought to the fore for me on a personal level is the fact that up until now, based on how I've been taught, based on who has taught me, based on where I've lived, based on how I've grown up, based on where I've worshipped, I've started to realize that I've had very little choice in the person that I would like to be. I've had very little choice in understanding, for example, individuals who identify as gay or homosexual or lesbian. I grew up in an extremely Christian home, went to like the ultimate, you know, Pentecostal church. And it's not to say that that was bad, but the point is that I have been raised to be a homophobe. Like I legitimately think something is wrong with gay people, right? And that's how I've been raised. And then I must now constantly daily realize and think about this. And then I have friends that are gay. And then they talk to me like normal human beings. And then I realize, oh, but actually, your dick is none of my business. You're actually such a nice person. Let me just be happy with that, you know? And so I'm starting to realize that I've not had a choice in thinking that black is beautiful. I've not had a choice in thinking that black people can be professors and educated because I've never been taught by black people. except the Xhosa teacher at school, who really doesn't count in that equation, right? So for me, it's that I haven't been the world that I've been born into, and the world that was created for me and offered to me as this is the world, go into it and flourish. That world in itself has still decided how it's going to shape me and frame me. And now I think for the first time, a lot of us are getting the opportunity to say to our parents, I don't agree. And then to make sense of what that means for us. So for me, it's again, moving away from the macro level, coming back to the micro level, deciding for yourself the perspectives and the thoughts and the ideas you want to have, surrounding yourself with people who constantly challenge those thoughts and perspectives, and at the end of the day, making a way up for yourself and deciding the person you want to be. And I think if everybody lived that deliberately, if we all lived that consciously, right, we wouldn't even need to have this conversation, because it would be like, oh yeah, but of course I must think about that. It's like it becomes a default thing, and that's what we need to get to, where the default is thinking, because I don't think that's been the default for a lot of us thus far. The default hasn't been thinking. The default has been frame, be happy within this frame. For a lot of us now, we're like, what is a frame? We don't even want to talk about the frame. So, that's where we need to go. Cool.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank you for your questions. I also want to thank Harmony for hosting us tonight.
Yay, thank you, Harmony.
I'd also like to thank Metanoia. And then the student from high school, it's Renesh.
Oh dear, and I use such bad language.
Thank you
Sorry, I forgot you and I didn't even, sorry.
Yeah.
Welcome, nice to see you.
So thank you everyone for coming. To you, Lovelyn, I'd just like to say, it was lovely to meet you, and the only thing I can say to you is, the only reason I'm black, because you're hot. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. So.